Marin had not planned to ruin the king's banquet. She had planned to sing 3 songs, bow once, and disappear back into the corridor where nobody important ever looked twice at her. Simple, forgettable, exactly the way she had survived her whole life inside these walls. But the evening had other plans. She was standing near the wine table during the pause between her second and third songs when Lord Fenwick Ashvale leaned over and said a joke about the rosemary garnish on the roasted lamb. Marin laughed because it was genuinely funny, and because Fenwick had the kind of easy warmth that made people laugh without thinking. He was tall, broad-shouldered, golden-haired, and smiling at her like she was a real person and not a piece of furniture the court wheeled out for entertainment. "You have a remarkable voice," Fenwick said. "I've never heard anything like it." "That's very kind, my lord," Marin replied. And then, because the wine had loosened her tongue just enough to be dangerous, she added, "Though I'd trade half my vocal range for your swordsmanship, that demonstration this afternoon was the finest I've ever seen at court." Fenwick grinned. He touched her elbow lightly, a polite, meaningless gesture. "You flatter me." "I never flatter," Marin said. "I simply observe with great enthusiasm." The sound that came next was not glass breaking, not a plate hitting stone. It was far worse. A low, guttural snarl cut through the noise of the hall like a blade through silk. Every voice in the room stopped. Every head turned. King Calder Vane was on his feet. His chair had been knocked backward, and his hands were braced against the table edge, fingers pressing into the wood so hard that the grain was splintering beneath them. His gray-green eyes were fixed on the place where Fenwick's hand rested on Marin's elbow, and they were not human anymore. The gold had bled in. That terrible, molten gold that every wolf in the kingdom knew and feared, because it meant the beast was close to the surface. Marin's breath stopped. The hall held its breath with her. 300 guests, 40 servants, a dozen guards, all frozen in a single collective heartbeat of pure animal terror. Because the Alpha King's wolf had not surfaced in public since the night his brother died. Not once in 2 years. Fenwick's hand dropped from her arm. The visiting lord took one careful step backward, his own wolf instinct screaming at him not to make sudden movements. Dashiell, the king's right hand, was already moving. He crossed the space between the high table and the king with the controlled urgency of a man approaching a lit fuse. His hand found Calder's shoulder. "Your Majesty," Dashiell murmured, his voice pitched low and calm. "You're in the Great Hall." Calder's gaze didn't move from Marin. The gold in his eyes pulsed once, twice, and then, like a door slamming shut, it was gone. The gray-green returned, his jaw locked. His fingers unclenched from the table edge, leaving gouges in the wood that would still be there in the morning. He straightened slowly. He said nothing. He looked at no one. He turned and walked out of the hall through the private door behind the dais, and the silence he left behind was so thick Marin could feel it pressing down on her. Then the room exhaled, and the whispers began. Every pair of eyes in the hall found Marin. Some were curious, some were afraid, some were calculating in a way that made her skin crawl. Fenwick had gone pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but Dashiell appeared at Marin's side before the lord could form a word. "Come with me," the beta said. "Now." Marin's legs moved before her brain caught up. She followed Dashiell out of the hall on numb feet, her pulse hammering so loudly she could barely hear the whispers chasing her through the door. The corridor was cold and empty. Dashiell walked fast, and Marin had to nearly jog to keep up with his long stride. Her mind was a mess of half-formed questions and a fear that sat like a stone in her stomach. "What just happened?" she managed. Dashiell didn't slow down. "That is what I need you to help me understand." "I didn't do anything," Marin protested, her voice cracking. "I was just talking to Lord Fenwick. I complimented his swordsmanship, that's all." The beta stopped walking. He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face wasn't anger or accusation. It was hope. Quiet, barely controlled hope. "Miss Marin," he said quietly, "the king has not lost control of his wolf since the night his brother died. Not once. Not during border disputes. Not during assassination attempts. Not during the Grey Claw siege when he fought for 3 days without rest." He paused, letting the weight of that settle over her. "And tonight, you smiled at another alpha, and his wolf nearly tore through in front of 300 witnesses." Marin gazed at him, the blood draining from her face. "Stay in the palace tonight," Dashiell said. "Do not leave the grounds." "Am I in danger?" Marin whispered. Dashiell's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Not from him. Never from him." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the corridor with her racing heart and the dawning suspicion that everything she thought she knew about the king's coldness toward her had just been turned inside out. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed in the musician's quarters and replayed every moment she had ever spent in the king's presence, every averted gaze, every room he had left the moment she entered, every conversation that stopped when she drew near. She had always believed he simply didn't see her, that she was beneath his notice, a conquered girl from a dead territory, tolerated but never truly seen. But you didn't splinter a table over someone you hadn't noticed. The knock came at dawn. A guard, face blank, voice flat. "The king's right hand requests your presence. Immediately." The room Dashiell brought her to was small and warm and smelled of old leather and ink. It was not the throne room. It was not the council chamber. It was a study tucked behind the library, the kind of room where decisions were made quietly and without ceremony. Dashiell gestured to a chair. Marin sat because her legs were not going to hold her much longer. "Before we begin," Dashiell said, settling into the chair across from her, "I need to know how much you understand about the king's condition." Marin blinked. "His condition?" The beta studied her for a long moment. "You've been at court since you were an infant, Miss Marin. You've watched him for years. Don't pretend you haven't noticed." Heat crept up her neck. She had noticed. Of course she had noticed. Not because she'd been watching him on purpose, but because it was impossible not to notice Calder Vane. He was the largest presence in any room, even when he was trying to be invisible, which he had been doing more and more frequently in recent years. "He's getting worse," Marin said quietly. It was not a question. Exhaustion flickered across Dashiell's face. "Yes." "The wolf," Marin said. "It's not just last night, is it? He's been struggling with it." "Struggling is a gentle word for what's happening to him." Dashiell leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "The king was forced to kill his own brother. You know the story." Marin's stomach dropped. She knew. Everyone knew some version of it. Prince Aldrich had gone feral during the border campaign, lost to his wolf, unable to shift back, unable to distinguish ally from enemy. The official account said the king had put him down mercifully. A single strike. A brother's duty. But the way Dashiell said it now, in this quiet room with the morning light barely touching the windows, made it sound like a wound that had never closed. "It broke the bond between Calder and his own wolf," Dashiell continued. "Not his mind. The bond. The partnership between a shifter and his beast. When Calder killed Aldrich, his wolf perceived it as a betrayal of pack. Of blood." Marin pressed her hands together in her lap. "What does that mean?" "It means his wolf has been trying to separate from him ever since, pulling away, becoming its own entity inside him." Dashiell's voice was careful, controlled, like he was explaining how a bomb worked while standing next to one. "On good days, the king holds the line. On bad days, the wolf surges forward and tries to take control." "And last night was a bad day," Marin whispered. "Last night was the worst in 2 years," Dashiell corrected. And the strange part is that it shouldn't have been. He paused, watching her face. The king was calm all evening, calmer than he's been in months. Your performance seemed to settle him. I was watching from across the hall, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, his shoulders were down. His hands were open. His breathing was easy. Marin frowned. My singing calmed him? Your voice did. Your presence did. Dashiell's gaze sharpened. And then you walked away from the stage and you stood beside Lord Fenwick, and you laughed, and he touched your arm. He touched my arm, Marin corrected automatically. The distinction does not matter to an unbonded wolf that has just identified its mate. The words hit her like cold water. Mate. The room seemed to tilt. Marin gripped the arms of the chair. That's not possible. The king believes the same thing. He recognized you years ago, long before the fracture, and he kept his distance even then. He told himself it was the wrong time, the wrong match, that you were too young. Dashiell sat back. Then his brother died and the wolf shattered, and the reason to stay away became a matter of survival, not just propriety. He believed his wolf was too dangerous, too fractured, to be trusted near a mate. Marin's throat constricted. Years. He had kept away from her for years. Every averted gaze, every room abandoned, every silence that had made her feel invisible and worthless and small had been him fighting to stay away from her. Not because he didn't see her, because he saw her too much. Why are you telling me this? Marin managed. Because after last night, the distance is no longer working. Dashiell's voice dropped. The wolf declared itself in front of 300 people. There is no putting that back in the cage. So what happens now? Now, Dashiell said. I need to find out why your voice calms his wolf when nothing else on this earth has managed it. And for that, I need you to agree to a plan you're not going to like. Marin watched him, her pulse drumming in her ears. The king has a meeting with his war council this afternoon, Dashiell continued. I want you in the room. He'll never allow that. He won't know you're there, not at first. Dashiell held up a hand before she could protest. There is a gallery above the council chamber. You'll sit there, out of sight, and you'll sing, quietly, under your breath. And I will watch what it does to him. Marin opened her mouth, closed it. The idea was absurd. She would be manipulating the king without his knowledge, using some power she didn't understand on a man who hadn't consented to it. If it works, Dashiell said, reading her hesitation, then we have a way to help him. If it doesn't, you go back to the musicians' quarters and we never speak of this again. And if he finds out? Dashiell's expression hardened. Then I'll take the blame. This was my idea. You were following orders. Marin sat with the weight of it for a long, trembling breath. Then she nodded. The gallery above the council chamber was narrow, dusty, and clearly not designed for anyone to spend time in. Marin settled onto the wooden bench with her back against the stone wall, and her heart lodged in her throat. Through the carved lattice below, she could see the chamber, the long table, the maps, the advisors filing in one by one. And then Calder entered. Even from above, his presence compressed the air in the room. He moved like a caged thing, all coiled power and locked down control. He sat at the head of the table, and Marin watched his hands flatten against the surface, fingers spreading, pressing down like he was anchoring himself to the wood. His jaw was clenched. The muscles in his neck were taut. He looked like a man holding himself together through sheer willpower. Marin swallowed hard, leaned back against the stone, and began to hum. It was barely audible. A lullaby she'd known since childhood. A melody from the old territory that had lodged in her bones before memory could name it. The sound drifted down through the lattice like smoke. Nothing happened at first. The advisors spoke. Calder listened, his posture unchanged, his expression carved from granite. Then, 8 minutes in, She saw it. His fingers loosened against the table. Not much. Just enough that his knuckles were no longer white. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The tight line of his jaw eased, and his breathing, which had been shallow and controlled, deepened. Marin kept humming. Her eyes burned. By the 20-minute mark, Calder was leaning back in his chair. Not relaxed. He was still the king, still alert, still listening, but the white-knuckled tension was gone. He looked, for the first time since she'd seen him the night before, like a man instead of a cage. The meeting lasted an hour. Marin hummed through all of it, switching melodies when her throat ached, keeping the sound just below the threshold of notice. When the advisors filed out, Calder remained seated, his eyes closed, his head tipped back slightly. He looked exhausted. He looked almost peaceful. Then his eyes opened. His head turned. He looked directly up at the lattice, directly at the place where she was sitting, and Marin's blood went cold. "Dashiell," the king said quietly, his voice carrying through the empty chamber. "Who is in the gallery?" A beat of silence. "Send her down." Marin descended the narrow stairs on legs that had forgotten how to work properly. The council chamber was empty now except for the king and Dashiell, who stood near the door with the careful stillness of a man bracing for impact. Calder hadn't moved from his chair. He sat at the head of the table, one hand resting on the wooden surface, the other curled loosely in his lap. He didn't look at her when she entered. He didn't look at Dashiell. He looked at the far wall like it had personally wronged him. "Sit," he said. Marin sat. The chair was too large for her, built for broad-shouldered lords and armored generals. She felt like a child perched on a throne. The silence stretched. Marin counted her own heartbeats and made it to 14 before Calder spoke again. "How long have you known?" His voice was low, rough, controlled in a way that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Not angry, exactly. Wounded. "Known what, Your Majesty?" Marin asked, though she suspected the question was a trap. His gaze finally moved to her, and the impact of it was physical. Gray-green eyes, sharp and deep and far too perceptive, fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to look away and also made it impossible to do so. "That your voice does that to me," he said. Marin's mouth went dry. "I found out this morning. Dashiell told me." Calder's jaw tightened. He cut a look at his beta that could have peeled paint. Dashiell, to his credit, didn't flinch. "It was necessary," Dashiell said. "You've been getting worse." "I am managing." "You shattered a table in front of 300 people last night because a visiting lord touched her arm." The silence that followed was deafening. Calder's hand curled into a fist on the table, and Marin watched the tendons in his forearm go taut beneath the rolled sleeve of his shirt. "That," the king said through his teeth, "was a lapse." "That was your wolf making a claim," Dashiell replied, his tone quiet but unyielding. "And every alpha in that hall recognized it." Marin wished the floor would open and swallow her. She sat very still, her hands pressed together in her lap, and tried to become invisible. She had spent her whole life becoming invisible in this castle. It had never been so impossible. Calder's eyes returned to her. The gold flickered just for an instant at the edges of his irises, and then it was gone. "You're afraid," he said. Not a question. "I'm terrified," Marin admitted, because there seemed to be no point in lying to a man who could probably hear her heartbeat from across the table. A crack appeared in the granite of his expression. "You don't need to be afraid of me." "I'm not afraid of you," Marin said, and was startled to realize she meant it. "I'm afraid of whatever is happening. I'm afraid because no one has explained anything to me, and because last night you looked at Lord Fennec like you were going to tear his throat out, and because an hour ago I was sitting in a gallery humming a lullaby while you relaxed like I'd drugged you." She paused to breathe. Both men were watching her. And I'm afraid, she finished, her voice thinner now, because you've treated me like I don't exist for as long as I can remember, and apparently there's a reason for that, and no one will just tell me what it is. The silence that followed pressed against her skin. Calder's fist unclenched. He looked away, toward the window, and his throat worked around a swallow. When he spoke, his voice was stripped to the bone. It isn't safe for you to be near me. So I've gathered, Marin said. And yet, here I am, and your wolf is quieter than it's been since Aldrich died. Dashiell made a small sound that might have been approval. Calder shot him another dangerous look. I'm not asking for explanations tonight, Marin added, forcing her voice level. But I deserve to know what the arrangement is. Dashiell said there would be an arrangement. Calder's gaze snapped to his beta. Dashiell returned it evenly. She calms your wolf, Dashiell said simply. We need to understand why, and we need to understand how far the effect extends. I'm proposing a controlled test. 7 evenings. She sits with you in your study while you work. She speaks or sings as she chooses. I observe and document the effect on your condition. Absolutely not, Calder said. Your Majesty, with respect, you are running out of time. Dashiell's voice hardened, just enough to make Marin understand that this was a conversation they had been having for months. The episodes are increasing. The wolf surfaced publicly last night. If we don't find a way to slow this down, the wolf will take you, and everything you've sacrificed to hold this kingdom together will have been for nothing. Calder didn't respond. His teeth were clenched, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and Marin watched a war play out behind his face. Pride against desperation, control against need, the stubborn, grinding refusal to accept help from anyone, let alone from her. 7 evenings, Marin said quietly. That's all. If it doesn't help, I'll go back to the musicians' quarters and you can go back to pretending I don't exist. His eyes found hers. There was hurt there, raw and barely concealed. I have never pretended you don't exist, he said. The words landed like a blow. Marin blinked, her throat tightening around a response she couldn't name. Then the king stood. He buttoned his cuffs with sharp, deliberate movements. 7 evenings, he said to Dashiell without looking at either of them. She speaks. She doesn't touch me. She doesn't ask questions. And after 7 days, if there's no measurable improvement, this ends. He left the room before Marin could respond. The door closed behind him, and the study fell into silence. Dashiell exhaled slowly. That went better than I expected. He hates this, Marin said. He hates needing help, Dashiell corrected. There's a difference. The beta moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back at her. Tomorrow evening, his private study, sunset. Dashiell, Marin called before he could leave. The thing at the banquet. The wolf surfacing. Was it really because I complimented Lord Fenwick? The beta considered her for a moment. It was because you smiled at Fenwick the way you've never once smiled at the king, he said. And the wolf couldn't bear it. The door closed behind him, and Marin sat alone in the empty chamber, her hands trembling in her lap, and the echo of those words settling into her like a splinter she would never be able to remove. The first evening was agony. Marin arrived at the king's study precisely at sunset, her palms damp and her throat tight. The room was smaller than she expected. A fireplace along one wall, bookshelves lining 2 others, a heavy desk positioned near the window where the last of the daylight fell across stacks of correspondence and maps. Calder sat behind the desk. He did not look up when she entered. He did not acknowledge the door opening or closing. His pen moved across a document in quick, precise strokes, and his posture was locked tight in a way that told Marin every muscle in his body was aware of her presence regardless. She sat in the chair Dashiell had placed near the far wall. It was positioned as far from the desk as the room's dimensions would allow, which was still close enough that she could see the dark circles beneath the king's eyes and the faint tremor in his writing hand. Good evening, Your Majesty, Marin offered. Nothing. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the bookshelves. She looked at the fire. She looked at the king's hand moving across the page and noticed the way his grip on the pen was too tight, the pressure leaving grooves in the paper. Would you like me to sing, or would you prefer talking? She asked. Whichever you do, Calder said without raising his eyes. Do it quietly. Marin sang. She chose an old ballad from the territories, a melody about a river that forgot the way to the sea, and she kept her voice low, barely above a whisper. The music filled the spaces between the scratch of the pen and the pop of the fire. By the third verse, the tremor in Calder's hand had stilled. She didn't say anything about it. She finished the song and started another, then another. When her throat grew tired, she switched to talking. She told him about the library cat who had taken up residence on the third floor and refused to be evicted by the librarian. She told him about the scullery maid who had accidentally baked a coin into the head cook's birthday cake and was now convinced it was either a blessing or a lawsuit. She didn't expect him to respond. He didn't. But his pen slowed, and the taut line of his spine eased 1 degree at a time, like ice giving way to a slow thaw. She stayed for 2 hours. When she stood to leave, Calder's pen stopped. Same time tomorrow, he said, still not looking at her. Yes, Your Majesty. She was at the door when his voice caught her again. The cat. In the library. What color is it? Marin turned. Orange, with one ear that folds over like a crumpled envelope. The ghost of a smile moved across his mouth. Good night, he said. Good night, Your Majesty. By the third evening, Marin had stopped expecting conversation and started simply existing in the room. She sang when the mood struck her. She talked when the silence felt too heavy. She told him stories about the castle, about the servants, about the ridiculous things that happened in the corners of the palace that a king would never see. He never responded directly, but she began to notice things. The fire was always stoked before she arrived. A second cup appeared on the tea tray beside his desk, positioned on the edge closest to her chair. The evening after that, the chair itself had been moved 3 feet closer to the desk. Marin said nothing about any of it. She simply sat in the chair that had migrated toward him and drank the tea that had been poured for her, and let the warmth of these small, unspoken gestures settle into a place inside her that had been cold for a very long time. 2 nights later, she arrived to find the king standing by the window instead of sitting behind his desk. The sunset threw amber light across his face, and for a moment, before he turned, she saw him unguarded. The exhaustion carved into every line, the way his hand gripped the window frame like he was holding himself upright. You look tired, she said before she could stop herself. His mouth pressed into a hard line. I'm fine. You're not fine. You look like you haven't slept in days. He turned to face her, and the gold flickered in his eyes, not the violent, surging gold from the banquet. Dimmer, sadder, like a candle guttering in a draft. I don't sleep, he said flatly. The wolf doesn't allow it. Marin's lungs emptied. Ever? Not for more than a few minutes at a time. When I close my eyes, the wolf pushes forward. It tries to take over. He said it like he was reporting the weather. Flat, factual, without self-pity. The only way to stop it is to stay awake. Since Aldrich, Marin whispered. You've been fighting this since that night. Don't, he said, his voice sharpening. Don't look at me like that. Like what? Like I'm a thing that needs saving. Marin held his gaze. I'm not looking at you like you need saving. I'm looking at you like a man who hasn't slept in 2 years and is somehow still standing, and I'm wondering how on earth you're still alive. His mouth opened, closed. An emotion she couldn't read crossed his face. Then he sat behind his desk, pulled a document toward him, and picked up his pen. The conversation was over. Marin sat in her chair. She began to sing, soft and low, the same river song from the first evening. And she watched, as she always did, as the tension slowly bled out of his shoulders, as his pen leveled, as his breathing deepened into a rhythm that almost resembled peace. The next evening, she pushed the boundary. I could stay longer, she offered. Past the 2 hours, if it would help. It wouldn't, he said immediately. You don't know that. I know that the longer you're near me, the harder it becomes for my wolf to let you leave. The words came out rough, almost angry, and then he seemed to hear what he'd said. His pen stopped. A flush crept up the back of his neck. Marin's pulse quickened. The wolf doesn't want me to leave? The wolf wants many things it cannot have, Calder said, his voice clipped. Go home, Miss Marin. She went. But she carried his words with her through the dark corridors and into her narrow bed, and she turned them over and over in her mind until sleep finally pulled her under. On the 7th evening, the final evening of their arrangement, Calder was not at his desk. He was sitting in the chair by the fire, and the desk had been pushed to the side, and beside the hearth, barely 2 feet from his chair, someone had placed a second seat with a blanket folded over the arm. Marin stopped in the doorway. You're staring, Calder said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the fire, and the gold light played across his features in a way that made her breath catch. You move the furniture, Marin said. The study needed rearranging. You put my chair next to yours. It's a practical adjustment. The proximity appears to increase the effect. Marin bit her lip to keep from smiling and sat down. They were close enough now that she could smell him. Cedar and iron and a warmth beneath it that made her wolf stir restlessly under her skin. Last night, she began, then stopped. Calder turned his head slightly, not looking at her directly, but acknowledging her. Waiting. Dashiell says the effect has been significant. Your wolf hasn't surged once this week. The episodes have stopped while I've been present. I know. So what happens after tonight? Our arrangement ends. The fire crackled. A log shifted in the grate, sending sparks spiraling upward. It ends, Calder said quietly. Marin watched his profile, the tension carved into his profile, the shadows beneath his eyes that never seemed to fade. And then what? You go back to fighting alone? To not sleeping? To white-knuckling your way through every hour until the wolf finally wins? That's not your concern. It became my concern the moment your wolf decided I was its mate. The word hung in the air between them, bright and dangerous. Calder went very still. His hand, resting on the arm of his chair, tightened until his knuckles blanched. He still wasn't looking at her, but she could see the muscle in his jaw working, the rapid rise and fall of his breathing. You shouldn't say that word, he said. Why not? It's what's happening, isn't it? Marin. Her name was a warning. Low, rough, fraying at the edges. I spent my whole life thinking you couldn't see me, she said, and her voice shook, but she didn't stop. Every day of being invisible, and now I find out you've been watching me the whole time, staying away on purpose because you thought it would keep me safe. She leaned forward in her chair, close enough to touch. She didn't. But it's not keeping you safe, it's killing you. He turned to face her then. The full force of his gaze, gray-green, shot through with gold and filled with an ache so vast it stole the breath from her lungs. If the connection between us forms fully, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and I lose the fight with my wolf, I won't be me anymore, Marin. I'll be the beast. And the beast won't know the difference between protecting you and destroying you. Marin's eyes burned. She looked at this man, this king, who had carried the weight of a fractured soul since the night he killed his brother without asking a single person for help, and a door inside her cracked wide open. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. His breath caught. His body went taut as a bowstring, but he didn't pull away. Then don't lose, she whispered. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. The fire popped. A gust of wind pressed against the window. And beneath her palm, so slowly she might have imagined it, his fingers turned and laced through hers. He held her hand like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. And Maren held his back, her pulse racing, her wolf singing beneath her skin, and knew with absolute certainty that 7 days had not been enough. It would never be enough. She looked up and found him watching her. His eyes were soft in a way she had never seen before. The gold was there, but it wasn't sharp. It was warm, quiet. "I'll speak with Dashiell," he said, his voice rough. "The arrangement can be extended." The feeling that flooded through Maren was so fierce and tender she couldn't speak around it. She squeezed his hand. Outside the window, the last of the light was fading. Inside the study, the fire burned low and golden, and for the first time since his brother's death, the king didn't let go. The arrangement stretched past 7 evenings and into 14, then 20. The days blurred into a rhythm that Maren didn't realize she was depending on until it became the axis around which everything else turned. Mornings in the musicians' quarters, practicing scales, mending instrument strings, pretending her mind wasn't already in his study. Afternoons in the great hall or the gardens, performing for courtiers who looked at her differently now. Not with curiosity anymore, with suspicion or calculation. Evenings with the king. The chairs had migrated again, no longer side by the fire, but angled toward each other, close enough that if she extended her arm, she could touch him. She didn't. The rule still held. No touching, no questions, only her voice, filling the space between them like water finding its level. But the rules were fraying. He spoke now. Not much, not freely, but in fragments that felt like gifts. He told her about Aldrich, not the official version, the one that ended with mercy and duty, but the real one. The one where his brother had been brilliant and reckless and too proud to ask for help when the wolf started winning. The one where Calder had watched the signs for months and said nothing because he'd convinced himself it would pass. "I should have intervened sooner," he said one evening, his voice stripped to the bone. "Before it was too late. Before the only option left was the worst one." Maren said nothing. She had learned that silence was sometimes more valuable than comfort, and that Calder could sense the difference between someone who was listening and someone who was waiting to speak. "Some nights I can still feel his heartbeat stopping under my hand," Calder said. "My own brother. My own blood." The fire crackled. Maren's eyes burned, but she didn't look away. "That's when the wolf turned on me," he continued, watching the flames. "Not during the act. After. When I felt relief." His voice cracked on the word. "What kind of man feels relief at killing his brother?" "The kind who watched his brother suffer and couldn't stop it," Maren said softly. "Relief that the suffering ended isn't the same as relief that he died." Calder looked at her. His eyes were wet. He blinked once, hard, and the moisture was gone, locked away behind the mask he wore for everyone except, increasingly, her. That night, she lingered longer than usual. The candles burned low. The fire reduced itself to embers and amber light. Calder's eyes had closed, not in sleep, but in a rest so fragile that the sound of her breathing might shatter it. She should leave. She knew she should leave, but weeks of growing closeness had changed the pull between them. It had deepened beyond proximity, beyond scent, beyond the sound of her voice. The connection that Calder had spent years resisting was strengthening whether either of them allowed it or not. And tonight, sitting this close, watching him surrender to a rest he couldn't find alone, Maren reached out and touched his hand. His eyes flew open. The gold surged, bright and sudden and consuming, swallowing the gray-green. But it wasn't violent. It was hungry. His fingers closed around hers with a grip that was almost painful, and a sound escaped his throat that was half groan, half sob. Then the world tilted. One moment she was in the study, firelight on stone walls, the king's hand crushing hers. The next, she was somewhere else, a forest. But not any forest she had ever seen or imagined. The trees rose like pillars of iron and pale bone, their branches bare and sharp against a sky the color of ash. The ground beneath her feet was soft and yielding and faintly warm, like skin. The air tasted of ash and iron. Marin's heart slammed against her ribs. She turned in a slow circle, searching for anything familiar, and found nothing. The silence was absolute, not the quiet of a winter wood, the silence of a held breath. Then she heard it. A low, resonant growl that vibrated through the ground and up through the soles of her feet and into her bones. She walked toward the sound because walking away did not seem like an option. The trees opened into a clearing, and there, in the center, she saw them. 2 wolves. One was enormous, black as a moonless night, its fur matted and its eyes burning with the same gray-green she knew from waking hours. Calder's wolf. She recognized it the way she recognized his voice, instinctively, in her marrow. The other was slightly smaller, silver-furred and wrong in a way that made her stomach turn. Its movements were jerky, erratic, like a puppet on broken strings. Its eyes were hollow and white, and fixed on the black wolf with single-minded fury. Aldrich, or what remained of him. The guilt given form, given teeth, given an eternal opponent. The wolves circled each other in the clearing, and Marin understood with sickening clarity what she was seeing. This was the fight. The one Calder waged every moment of every day. Not against his own wolf, not really. Against the ghost of his brother that his guilt had welded into his soul. The silver wolf lunged. The black wolf dodged, but barely, its movements sluggish and exhausted. How long had this been going on? Every night for 2 years, circling, fighting, never resting. "Calder?" Marin called out. The black wolf's head snapped toward her. Its eyes widened, and pure terror surfaced in them. The silver wolf struck. Its jaws closed around the black wolf's throat, and Calder's wolf went down hard, a sound of anguish tearing through the clearing. Marin screamed. She blinked, and she was back. The study. The dying fire. She was on her knees beside his chair, her hand still gripping his, and Calder was gasping like a man who'd been held underwater. His eyes were wild, gold and green warring behind his irises. His free hand found her face, cupping her cheek, his thumb pressing against her cheekbone like he needed to confirm she was solid. "You were there," he rasped. "You saw." "I saw," Marin whispered. "Calder, the silver wolf, it's... Don't." The word was a blade. He pulled his hand from her face, pulled his fingers from hers, and stood so abruptly that his chair scraped against the stone floor. He crossed the room and braced his hands against the mantelpiece, his head bowed, his shoulders heaving. "This is what I was afraid of," he said. "The pull between us is dragging you in, into the fracture, into the place where the wolf fights. I can help," Marin started. "You cannot help." He turned on her, and his face was a ruin, raw and furious and terrified. "Do you understand what happens if you're in there when the silver wolf wins? Do you understand what that means?" Marin's throat closed. "It means you die with me." His voice broke on the last word. "If the wolf takes me while you're inside, you don't wake up." The room fell silent except for the sound of his ragged breathing. "This is over," Calder said. "The arrangement, the evenings, all of it. You don't come near me again." "Calder, please." "That's an order." His voice was iron, but his hands were shaking. "From your king." Marin looked at him across the dim room. She could feel the thread between them straining, a physical ache that intensified with every step of distance. "You're going to die if you do this alone," she said. "Then I die," he replied, "but not you. Never you." He turned his back to her. The dismissal was absolute. Marin left the study on legs that barely held her. She made it to the end of the corridor before the tears came, silent and burning, and she pressed her back against the cold stone wall and slid to the floor because her body simply could not carry the weight of what had just happened. He was going to let the wolf kill him rather than risk her life. And she had no idea how to save a man who had already decided he wasn't worth saving. The days without him were a slow unraveling. Marin had expected to miss him. She had not expected the missing to be a physical assault on every system in her body. The headaches began on the second day. Dull at first, a persistent pressure behind her eyes that no amount of rest or water could touch. By the fourth day, they were blinding. She performed her duties in the great hall with the curtains drawn, wincing at every sharp note that left her own throat. The appetite went next. She sat in front of meals and couldn't bring herself to lift the fork. Her wolf, dormant her entire life, was now a constant restless presence under her skin, pacing, whining, scratching at the walls of her consciousness like an animal clawing to get out. She caught glimpses of him, a flash of dark hair across the courtyard, his tall frame silhouetted in a high window. Once she passed his study door and heard something crash inside, followed by a silence so heavy it leaked through the oak and pooled around her feet. She pressed her hand to the door. She didn't go in. By the 8th day, the tremors started. Fine trembling in her hands that she couldn't control, couldn't hide. She dropped a goblet during an evening performance, and the sound of it ringing against the stone floor silenced the hall. 100 faces turned toward her, and Marin smiled, apologized, picked up the goblet, and continued singing with level breath and shaking hands. That night, Dashiell found her in the musicians' quarters. "You look terrible," the beta said from the doorway. "Thank you, Dashiell. Always a comfort." He didn't smile. "He's worse." Marin's hands clenched in her lap. How much worse? 3 episodes in the last 2 days. The wolf surfaced during a meeting with the border lords. Scared the delegation half to death. Dashiell's voice was even, but she could hear the fear beneath it. "He hasn't slept, not even for minutes. His hands shake when he thinks no one's looking." "Like mine," Marin whispered, holding up her trembling fingers. Dashiell looked at them. His expression shifted into a grim line. "I've sent for Mistress Orla, the palace's senior healer. She understands bonds and wolf physiology better than anyone alive." "He won't let me near him," Marin said, and her voice cracked despite every effort to hold it. "He ordered me away." "I know." Dashiell's mouth thinned. "I'm working on it." But working on it wasn't fast enough. 3 days later, Marin was summoned to perform for a visiting dignitary. A formal affair in the throne room. Full court attendance. She'd prepared 2 ballads and a folk song, simple pieces she could manage even with the headaches that now never fully retreated. She didn't know Calder would be there. She should have guessed. It was a state function. But the sight of him at the far end of the throne room hit her like a wall. He was seated on the raised dais, straight-backed and stone-faced, and even from across the room she could see the cost of the last 11 days written on his body. He was thinner. The hollows beneath his cheekbones were sharper. His fingers were white against the carved arms of the throne. He didn't look at her. He watched the far wall, face set like stone, every ounce of his will focused on holding himself together. Marin took her position near the front of the room and began to sing. The first note left her lips, and she saw it happen. The loosening across his shoulders. His grip on the throne easing a fraction. His lungs expanding into a deeper breath than the shallow, controlled ones he'd been taking. Their eyes met. For one unguarded moment, everything he was hiding was written across his face, exhaustion and longing and a grief so profound it made her knees buckle. Then the mask slammed back into place, and he looked away. Marin kept singing. She poured everything into it, every ounce of the ache that had been eating her alive for 11 days, and the music swelled through the throne room like a living thing. She was halfway through the second ballad when her vision flickered. A gray pulse at the edges, a momentary dimming, like a candle flame bending in a draft. She blinked hard and pushed through it. The high note climbed, pure and unwavering, and her hands were trembling at her sides, but her voice held. The gray came back, stronger. The room tilted. The floor seemed to shift beneath her feet. She could hear her own voice growing distant, as if she were listening to herself from underwater. "Finish the song," she told herself. "Just finish the song." She didn't finish the song. Her knees gave out between one note and the next. The music cut off mid-phrase, and the silence that replaced it was absolute. She was falling, the floor rushing up, the gasps from the assembled court crashing over her like a wave. She never hit the ground. Arms caught her, strong, bruising in their urgency. She was lifted against a chest that was heaving with ragged breath, and a voice was saying her name, over and over, shattered and furious and agonized. "Marin, Marin, open your eyes, Marin." She tried. The world was a blur of gold light and dark shapes. She could smell cedar and iron. She could feel his heartbeat hammering against her cheek. "Don't you dare," he snarled, and his voice was half man and half beast, the gold blazing in his eyes for every single person in the throne room to see. "Don't you dare leave me." She wanted to tell him that was ironic, considering he was the one who'd sent her away. But the words wouldn't form. The gray swallowed everything, and she went limp in his arms. She woke in Orla's healing ward. The light was pale and thin. Herbs hung from the ceiling in dried bundles, and the smell of them was comforting in a distant, half-conscious way. Calder was beside her bed, not sitting, kneeling. His head was bowed over her hand, which he held between both of his, and his shoulders were shaking. "Your Majesty," she croaked. His head snapped up. His face was wrecked, red-eyed and hollow and stripped of every defense. He looked at her like she was the only solid thing left in the world. "Don't ever do that again," he said, his voice raw. "Don't ever send me away again," she replied. A woman's voice cut through the moment, firm and unimpressed by the emotional devastation in the room. "Both of you are going to die if you don't stop being idiots." Marin turned her head. A tall woman with steel-gray hair and sharp dark eyes stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, her healer's apron still dusted with dried powder. "Mistress Orla, the pull between you is incomplete," Orla continued, ignoring the dangerous look the king leveled at her. "It has been forming for years, whether either of you wanted it or not. Proximity accelerates it. Distance doesn't stop it. It simply makes the process agonizing." "I was trying to protect her," Calder said through his teeth. "You were trying to die nobly," Orla corrected, her voice sharpening. "Which is a less romantic way of saying you were willing to kill both of you rather than risk letting someone in." The words landed like a slap. Calder flinched. Orla moved to the side of the bed and placed 2 fingers against Marin's wrist, counting her pulse. "The fracture in your wolf is feeding on isolation. The more you push her away, the stronger the silver wolf becomes. And the stronger it becomes, the weaker your hold." "I know that," Calder said. "Then you also know that you have perhaps a month before the fracture becomes permanent," Orla continued, her eyes fixed on Marin's now. "When that happens, the wolf takes him. Fully and irreversibly. He won't be Calder anymore. He'll be the beast, and only the beast." Marin's blood went cold. "And because of the connection forming between you," Orla added, her voice dropping to a gentler register, "when his mind goes, yours will follow." The incomplete bond will drag you down with him. Not into death necessarily, into a kind of sleep you don't wake from. Marin looked at the healer. Beside her, Calder had gone still as stone. 1 month, Marin whispered. Less, Orla replied, if you keep tearing yourselves apart. The silence in the ward was absolute. Marin looked at Calder. He looked at her. And in the space between them, the thread that connected them pulsed once, warm and urgent and undeniable, like a heartbeat that belonged to neither of them and both of them at the same time. Orla sent the king away, not gently. She informed him that her patient needed rest and that his presence, while emotionally relevant, was medically counterproductive at this particular moment. Calder looked like he wanted to argue. Orla looked like she had been staring down difficult men since before he was born. The king left. Marin lay in the healing ward bed, watching the dried herbs on the ceiling sway, and tried to process the fact that she had roughly a month to live. Orla sat beside her, checked her pulse again, and poured her a glass of water. Drink, the healer commanded. Marin drank. The water tasted like nothing. Everything tasted like nothing lately. I'm going to tell you something, Orla said, settling into the chair with the easy authority of a woman who had earned the right to be blunt, and I need you to hear it clearly. Marin nodded. You can still walk away. The words hung in the air. The bond is incomplete, Orla continued, which means it can still be severed. Not easily, not painlessly, but it can be done. I would need to prepare a specific tonic. The process would take several days. You would be ill for weeks afterward, but you would survive. Marin's throat constricted. And Calder? Orla's expression didn't change, but a softness surfaced behind her eyes. He would not survive. The severance would accelerate the fracture. Without the bond anchoring him, the wolf would take him within days. Then it's not really walking away, is it? Marin said, her voice brittle. It's choosing to save myself and condemn him. It's choosing to live, Orla corrected quietly. There's no shame in that. Marin fixed her gaze on the ceiling. The herbs swayed in a draft she couldn't feel. You were brought to this court as an infant, Orla said, studying her face. Taken from a territory that no longer exists, raised in a castle that was never truly your home. You've spent your life trying to earn a place here by being useful, by being small, by not taking up more room than you were given. Marin's throat closed. She didn't trust herself to speak. And now, Orla went on, you're being asked to risk your life for a man who spent years pretending you were invisible. I would understand if you chose yourself, Marin. No one would fault you for it. The silence stretched. Marin turned the healer's words over in her mind, and they sat there like stones, heavy and smooth and impossible to argue with. She thought about a lifetime of empty rooms and averted gazes. She thought about the narrow bed in the musicians' quarters and the way it had never felt like home. Just like nothing in this castle had ever felt like home. And then she thought about a chair that migrated 3 feet closer in the night, a teacup placed on the edge of a desk, a king who asked about the color of a library cat, a hand that laced through hers like she was the only anchor he had left. I'm not choosing myself, Marin said, and I'm not choosing him because I think I owe him anything, or because I want to be useful. She met Orla's gaze. I'm choosing him because he's mine, and I'm done being invisible. Orla held her stare for a long moment. Then the healer nodded once, slowly, and pride moved across her weathered face. Then you'd better go tell him that, Orla said, before he does something catastrophically noble. Marin found him in his chambers, not the study, his private rooms, the ones she had never entered. The guard at the door let her pass without question, which meant Dashiell had cleared the way. The room was dark. A single candle burned on the mantelpiece, throwing long shadows across the stone walls. The bed was massive and untouched, the covers still smooth. He hadn't slept in it. She doubted he'd slept in it for years. Calder stood by the window, his forehead pressed against the glass. He didn't turn when she entered, but his body registered her. She saw it in the way his spine straightened, the way his hands curled at his sides. "Orla told you to walk away," he said. Not a question. "She did. You should listen to her." "I'm done listening to people who tell me to leave." He turned then. The candlelight caught his face, and the sight of him made Maren ache. The shadows under his eyes were so dark they looked like bruises. His skin was pale. His hands were trembling. Maren. Her name was a plea and a warning and a surrender all at once. "If you stay, I can't promise you anything. I can't promise I'll win this fight. I can't promise the wolf won't take me. I can't promise you'll be safe." She crossed the room. Each step felt like falling, terrifying and inevitable, and she couldn't stop. "I'm not asking for promises," she said. She stopped in front of him, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his body, close enough to see the gold flickering behind his eyes, not violent, not aggressive, but yearning. "I'm not asking for safe," she whispered. "I'm asking for you." His composure broke. It didn't crack slowly this time, it shattered. A sound escaped him that was half growl, half groan, anguished and hungry, and his hands were on her face, cradling her jaw, tilting her head back. "Tell me to stop," he breathed, his mouth a fraction from hers. "Tell me this is a mistake." "It's not a mistake," Maren said, and she closed the distance. The kiss was everything she hadn't known she was waiting for. His mouth was warm and urgent, and the moment their lips met, the bond between them flared so bright she could feel it behind her closed eyes, a golden thread pulling taut, vibrating, alive. He kissed her like he was drowning and she was air. His hand slid from her face into her hair, and she gripped the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, needing more contact in a way that went deeper than skin. "I've wanted this," he said against her lips, his voice wrecked. "Since the moment I first heard you sing. You were 16 and you were performing in the Great Hall, and your voice was the only beautiful thing in that room. And I knew." "You knew, and you stayed away for years," Maren whispered. "Because I would rather have died than hurt you." "You hurt me by staying away." The words came out raw and honest, and she felt him flinch. "Every day you ignored me. Every time you left a room I entered, I thought there was something wrong with me, that I wasn't enough." He pulled back just far enough to look at her. His eyes were bright with unshed tears and warm gold. "You are everything," he said. "You have always been everything." Maren kissed him again, and this time it was slower, deeper, a conversation without words that said all the things neither of them could say out loud. His hands found her waist, her shoulders, the curve of her back, learning her shape with a reverence that made her tremble. What followed was tender and fierce and overwhelming in equal measure. He held her like she was the answer to every question he had ever been afraid to ask, and she held him back with equal devotion. When his lips found the curve of her neck, the mating bond surged between them, golden and blinding. He marked her, and she marked him, and the bond locked into place like a key turning in a lock that had waited years to be opened. It settled through her in a wave of warmth so deep it reached the place where her wolf lived, where her heartbeat originated, where the most fundamental part of herself resided. She could feel him there now, not beside her, within her, woven into the fabric of who she was. They lay together in the quiet that followed, his arms wrapped around her, her head resting against him. Calder pulled her closer, and she registered the precise moment his body surrendered to sleep. His breathing evened out. His muscles went slack. His heartbeat slowed to a deep, even rhythm against her cheek. Maren smiled against his skin. Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes, and she didn't wipe them away. He was sleeping, truly sleeping, in her arms, with the bond humming gold between them. For this one perfect moment, the fracture was silent, and the wolf was still, and the man she loved was at peace. She closed her eyes, let the warmth of him pull her under. She opened them inside the forest. The trees of iron and bone rose around her like the bars of a cage. Maren stood barefoot on the warm, yielding ground, her nightgown thin against the cold air, and tried to remember how to breathe. The sky above was the color of ash, lightless and low, pressing down on the canopy like a hand on a wound. She could hear them before she saw them, the snarling, the impact of bodies colliding, the terrible sound of the wolves colliding. Maren ran toward the clearing. The two wolves were there, locked in combat. But it was worse than before. The black wolf, Calder's wolf, was on the ground. Its fur was torn and dull. Its breathing was labored, each exhale a rattling wheeze. The silver wolf stood over it, dead white eyes blazing with a fury that had no end and no mercy. And Calder was on his knees at the edge of the clearing. Not the king, not the man who commanded rooms and ended wars. A broken version of him, stripped of armor and authority, his head bowed, his hands flat against the ground. He looked like a man who had been fighting for 2 years and had finally, completely, stopped. Calder, Maren called, her voice swallowed by the silence almost immediately. He didn't respond. The silver wolf turned its head toward her, its white eyes fixed on her with an intelligence that was not animal and not human, but parasitic, patient, endlessly hungry. Then it spoke, not with a mouth. The voice simply existed, filling the clearing from every direction at once, and it was Aldrich's voice, or what Calder believed Aldrich's voice had sounded like. Warm, familiar, poisoned. He can't hear you. He stopped listening a long time ago. Maren's skin crawled, but she didn't stop moving. She crossed the clearing toward Calder, stepping around the wolves, her bare feet silent on the ground that pulsed beneath her. "You're not Aldrich," she said to the silver wolf. "Of course I am," the voice replied, patient and amused. "I'm the version of Aldrich he carries, the one that asks every night why his brother's hand was the one that ended it. The one that wonders if there was another way. The one that knows the answer." Maren dropped to her knees beside Calder. His hands were shaking. His eyes were open but empty, fixed on the ground with the vacant gaze of a man who had long since stopped seeing anything except his own failure. She could feel his pain through the bond. It was staggering, a wall of guilt so thick and so old that it had calcified into a truth he no longer questioned. He deserved this. He deserved the fracture, the sleepless years, the slow destruction of himself, because he had killed his brother and felt relief when it was over. "That's not you talking," Maren said, gripping his shoulders. "That's the guilt. It's been feeding you the same poison for 2 years, and you've been swallowing it because you think you owe a debt." The silver wolf growled. The sound vibrated through the ground and up through Maren's knees. "You don't know what happened," the voice said, harder now. "You weren't there. You didn't see his face when the light left his eyes. You didn't feel his heart stop." "No," Maren agreed, her voice level despite the tears running down her cheeks. "I wasn't there. But I know what it looks like to carry a weight that isn't yours." She cupped Calder's face in her hands. His skin was cold. His eyes were somewhere far away. "I was 1 year old when they took me from my home," she said, and the words came from a place she had never opened for anyone. "A territory that doesn't exist anymore. A people I'll never know. I grew up in this castle with a name that didn't belong here, and a face that reminded everyone of what was conquered." The silver wolf shifted, uncertain. "For my whole life, I believed I was the debt," Maren continued. that my existence was the cost of someone else's war, that I had to earn every meal, every room, every breath I took in a place that wasn't mine. Calder's eyes flickered. A distant light, faint but present, surfaced behind the emptiness. "And you know what I learned?" Marin said, her thumbs brushing the tears from his cold cheeks. "I learned that carrying someone else's guilt doesn't honor them. It just buries you." The silver wolf snarled. "He killed me." "He freed you," Marin shot back, her voice rising. "Your wolf had taken you. You were gone, Aldrich. You were already gone. And your brother, this man right here, loved you enough to do the one thing no one else had the courage to do." The clearing went silent. The silver wolf watched her with its hollow eyes, and for the first time a flicker passed through them. A crack in the certainty. Marin turned back to Calder. His eyes had found hers. Awareness was surfacing, faint and fragile, rising from beneath the weight of years of self-inflicted punishment. "You felt relief," she whispered. "Not because he died, because he stopped suffering." "There's a difference, Calder. There has always been a difference." A sound escaped him, broken and raw and pulled from so deep it hurt to hear. "I miss him," he said. "I know. I dream about saving him every night, and every night I fail." "Because you can't save someone who was already lost." Marin pressed her forehead to his. "But you can forgive yourself for surviving." The silver wolf made a sound that was not a growl and not a howl, but a keening, aching noise that filled the clearing and the forest and the spaces between the iron trees. Marin looked up and saw the blank white eyes change. Just for a moment, they were not white. They were gray-green, warm and familiar and sad. The eyes of a brother who had been used as a weapon long after his death. "Let him go," Marin said, her voice breaking. "Let him rest." Calder's hand found hers. His grip was crushing, alive. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Not to Marin, to the silver wolf, to the memory of a brother he had never stopped mourning. "I'm sorry I couldn't find another way. I'm sorry the only mercy I could give you was the worst mercy there is." The silver wolf went still. The tension bled out of its body. The white eyes closed. And then, like mist burning off under morning sun, the silver wolf dissolved. Its form softened, thinned, became transparent. The keening faded into a sigh, a breath released after being held for far too long, and then it was gone. The black wolf rose to its feet, unsteady at first, shaking, wounded, but standing. It crossed the clearing slowly and pressed its massive head against Calder's chest. Marin watched his arms wrap around the wolf, his face buried in its dark fur, his whole body shaking with the force of a grief that was finally being allowed to move through him instead of eating him alive. The iron trees began to change. The bone-white branches softened, darkened, sprouted leaves that unfurled one by one, catching a light that hadn't existed moments before. The ash-gray sky cracked open, and pale gold light poured through. The wolf pressed closer. Calder held tighter. And then the wolf was gone. Not vanished. Absorbed. Reintegrated. The fracture closing like a wound finally allowed to heal. Calder gasped, his hands clutching at nothing and everything. Marin held him through it, her arms around his shoulders, her voice in his ear. "I've got you," she whispered. "I'm here. I've got you." The forest dissolved. The light swallowed everything. Marin woke in his bed, in his arms, in the warm darkness of his chambers. The candle on the mantelpiece had burned down to a stub. The fire was embers. Calder was awake beside her. His eyes were wet, but he was smiling. Not the ghost of a smile, not a careful, controlled expression. A real smile, fragile and luminous and full of a wonder that cracked her heart wide open. He cupped her face. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. "Thank you," he whispered. Maren smiled back through her own tears and pressed her lips to his palm. The bond hummed between them, warm and golden and whole. The fracture didn't heal overnight. Calder still woke in the dark sometimes, his breathing sharp, reaching for her before his eyes were fully open. But Maren was always beside him, and her hand always found his, and her voice always pulled him back before the old forest could reclaim him. The wolf was whole again, not tame, never tame, but no longer at war with itself. Calder described it once as having a limb restored that he'd forgotten was missing. "Everything is louder," he told her. "Brighter. I can smell the rain 3 valleys over. I forgot what that was like." The nightmares grew less frequent. Week by week, the old forest loosened its grip. He learned to sleep through the dark hours and wake without panic. He learned to say Aldrich's name without flinching. "You're allowed to remember him with love," Maren told him one night. "Grief and love aren't enemies. They've always lived in the same place." Their mating sent shockwaves through the court. A conquered ward as the Alpha King's bonded mate was not what the nobility had envisioned. The whispers followed Maren everywhere. She heard the edge in every polite smile. Some called her an opportunist. Others called her a curiosity. A few called her things far worse, but never within the king's hearing. Calder's patience with the court's displeasure lasted approximately 2 weeks before he addressed the issue with characteristic subtlety. "She is your queen," he told the assembled court, his voice carrying the full weight of the crown. "Treat her accordingly, or explain to me personally why you find that difficult." The whispers didn't stop. They never would. But they grew quieter. Months later, Maren stood in the great hall at another banquet, another performance. She sang the river song, the old ballad from a territory that no longer existed, and her voice filled the hall the way water fills a valley, finding every corner, every shadow, every empty space. At the high table, Calder watched her, not with the averted control of a man denying himself, with the open, unhidden warmth of a man who had stopped running. His wolf was quiet, his hands were open, his shoulders were down. Maren finished the final note and let the silence hold for 1 breath, then 2. Then she smiled at the king, and the king smiled back. No distance, no avoidance, no fractured wolves or iron forests or years of silence standing between them. Just a man and a woman who had fought through the worst of each other and chosen to stay. Maren stepped down from the stage. Calder extended his hand. She took it, and the bond between them hummed, warm and golden, as even as a heartbeat. They had earned this, every broken piece of it.